Welcome, I'm Kazumi, and this is a devlog for a Souls-like game I'm developing. In this devlog, I'll show you how I added the jump to the game. As always, let's start by looking at the end result. When the player presses a button, the character jumps, and will keep going upwards during the jump duration. After that, we snap to the ground or continue falling if there is no ground. The jump also has an initial force depending on our input and if we're sprinting or not. And some aerial control while dropping down to the ground. Before we see how everything was developed, some context is needed. Firstly, my player movement controller snaps the player position to the ground when he is grounded. And when grounded, I also disable gravity on the player rigid body. If I don't, the player will jitter up and down, because the gravity pulls down, and every update I would move the character position up to that of the ground, which is higher. But the rigid body velocity will keep accumulating force, and the jitter will only get stronger. You might be thinking the rigid body stops accumulating force once the collider touches the ground, and you would be right. However, my collider never touches the ground on purpose, as it helped me avoid other problems. Alright, let's talk about the jump. So first thing, I knew I wanted to have my jump keep going up and not snap to the ground immediately, as long as my player is still in that jump boost movement. I started out by writing my try jump function, which returns a boolean. It returns a boolean because my inputs are buffered, meaning they would keep trying to perform the action the input is linked to for an X amount of time. And they will keep trying as long as they get a false return from the function they called for. My first approach was really simple. I check if I'm grounded and not performing an action, and if so, I'll activate the jump skill animation and add force. I then added to my animation controller a falling animation while in air and an animation for the jump start. I already had an empty state named newState which had no animation clip as a placeholder, and I just transitioned into it when I wasn't grounded. I added the new jump state and changed the empty state name to be in air. I added a clip to it and added a transition from the jump start to in air. Finally, I created a new skill object and set it up correctly to match the jump state name. I connected the skill in the inspector and pressed play. Okay, maybe 400 force is a bit excessive. So I tried 40. Okay, that's still too much, but look at that superhero landing. Before reducing the jump force, I felt like the jump was too floaty, so I tried adding drag when I turn on the gravity, which is when I'm not grounded, and resetting it back to 0 when I am. It didn't give me the result I wanted, so I cancelled it. Also, the ledge push was developed in parallel to the jump, which is why I wasn't getting pushed there. For the sake of clarity in the videos, I separated the subjects. I played around some more and found out that I couldn't get off the ground consistently when trying to jump, so I started looking into fixing that. I reduced the velocity so getting off the ground will fail more consistently at least. I started by changing the way my movement code works so it will preserve the Y velocity always regardless of being grounded or not. My movement function always sets the player height position to the ground position if the character is grounded, so I added a boolean to this function that will allow to choose whether to do that or not. I then created a boolean called lerp to ground, and a timer counting the time passed since the jump started. Set it to false at the start of the jump, and to true 0.2 seconds after the jump started. I did this to give the character a grace period to get away from the ground after jumping, so that the ground detection will be far enough from the ground for the ground height snapping not to happen. However, still no luck, I still couldn't get off the ground. I then removed this piece of code which was in my fixed update, but still no liftoff. So finally, I busted out the breakpoints. And then I saw that on the first frame of my jump, I was still grounded. Which makes sense because the force gets added in fixed update, and I was checking in update. So the force wasn't even applied yet. I tried following the code to see where things go wrong, but I didn't find anything. So I decided to add more debug logs. And then I saw my velocity gets reset after the first frame. I then increased the grace period for the jump start. I still wasn't jumping, so I decided to increase it again just to be sure. I then realized that having two different lengths for ground detection, one when grounded and one when on air, causes some problems. So I adjusted my ground detection cast to be the same distance when I'm grounded and when I'm not. I reduced the grace period down again, and now I was jumping. Sort of. Okay, so I still wasn't jumping consistently. I went ahead and added more debug logs. I added a bunch of them and a debug break when I tried to jump. Now I could clearly see my velocity gets reset between the third and fourth debug. Great success. Now that I knew where the problem was happening, I tried to use breakpoints again. However, when using the breakpoints, my jump was working correctly. This was probably due to frame rate issues where stopping would change the outcome simply by giving things more time to process. You know the drill. More debugs. My main suspicion was that my velocity was getting reset during this project on plane function. And it was. Project on plane is how I adjust my walking direction so that it takes slopes into account. So instead of walking into the stairs, I actually changed the direction vector to be parallel to the slope. I decided not to call this move function for the duration of the grace period, and now I was jumping more consistently. I'm missing some parts of the recording, but what I did next was expose some hard-coded variables into serialized fields, so I can change them in the inspector. I then reverted the changes I just made, and I wish I could remember why, but I'm assuming I didn't like the way it was written. Sometimes looking back at these clips and writing the script for the video, I feel like I'm looking at myself coding in some drunken haze, and even I don't understand what I did or tried to do. But that's part of the magic. I then made some changes to achieve a jump that pushes you forward depending on the initial input and state you were when you tried to jump. As you can see, I cached the movement vector when I start the jump. I also reduced the drag when on air. I then added a new boolean called isJumping and set it to true at the start of the jump. And in update, I return if it's true and don't reach the movement code. And I set it back to false when I reach the ground. I then playtested some more and changed values as I needed. I added this little platform to help me check if my jump continues upward without snapping to the ground. At this point, I did a little code cleanup and separated the can jump check to its own function. I also added these stairs so I can jump on them as well. I then ran around playtesting some more and figured it was time to fix the animation controller. I added a landing state and connected all the needed transitions. I made sure to interrupt the landing animation into walking locomotion in case the total input is above 0.5. I then pressed play to test it. I noticed the jump were inconsistent, and that the landing animation wasn't always interrupted the way I intended it to be. I disabled my push collider, which is a collider that prevents getting pushed by enemies, and continued testing. And now the jump were more consistent. So I went to fix the animation control transitions. The locomotion needed to be connected to the on air when isn't grounded, instead of the landing animation. I then saw a problem when transitioning back to the locomotion because it had an exit time when it shouldn't have. I then played around with my capsule collider values trying out things, but I ended reverting it. I then removed the scaling on the jump based on the input. I tested my changes and felt like I needed to change the drag, which was hard coded, so I decided to finally expose it to the inspector. At this point, the initial jump force was working like I wanted, but after the force dissipated, it didn't feel good enough yet. I reduced the drag to 0, but it still didn't feel right. I then thought if the initial jump force could last longer, it would feel better, so I tried caching the initial jump vector to a local variable. And then continuously add it every frame. And as soon as I tried testing this out, my character people needed him and he had to go. I tried tweaking it a bit, which gave this floaty kinda cool looking jump, but definitely not what I was going for. I played around trying more things, however, at this point I was going on it for so long I was forgetting how a jump was supposed to feel. So I logged into Guild Wars 2 and started jumping around. Guild Wars 2 isn't exactly the jump feel like Sekiro, which is what I wanted, but I thought it would be a good idea to understand the differences and define how the jump I want to work. Guild Wars 2 jump is more controlled and precise, and it's this way because of the big amount of jumping puzzles the game has, which require that type of control. After jumping around in Guild Wars 2 for a while, I figured out what I wanted from my jump. I wanted an initial jump force when ascending and an aerial control when descending. So I tried adding aerial control in my update. Now I was adding force to the jump for a duration after jumping, and adding force according to the input. The jump was feeling better. I fixed the animation controller again by adding a transition from landing to the on-air state to account for the case when I fall down after just landing. Next, I noticed that when I jump, my action bool is true, and I didn't want that. When I activate a skill using my best skill handler class, a bool called in action is set to true. I use this boolean to determine how to move my character as well as what actions to allow doing. I didn't want to be considered in action when I do my jump, and to fix that I made some adjustments to my skill handler class. As well as changing some state behavior scripts on the states on the animation controller. I eventually removed all of these state behaviors, but that's another devlog. I then added rotation based on the character input direction when starting the jump. I continued to test out the jump until I came across this issue. When jumping onto a slope and inputting to move up along that slope during the jump, the character remained in a jump state. I wanted to use breakpoints to test this out, but since you have to jump and keep pressing the input and then add the breakpoint, it's a bit of a problem. Luckily, I already have a solution in place for these cases. Basically, I have a class that is in charge of taking the input and sending it down to the classes that currently need it. This class has an override option which lets me simulate the inputs without actually pressing the buttons. During the breakpoint, things seems to be working properly. So I thought it might be an animator issue. I decided to include in my update animator function and check if the player is jumping. I added a getter for the isJumping boolean and quickly crashed Unity as it was pointing to itself. I opened Unity back up and remade the slope I used for testing. And then tweaked the check on the update animator. And that seemed to solve the problem, at least on my test slope. However, I was still getting the same behavior bug which was caused from something else. So I copied the smaller slope angle and tested again. This time I entered the isJumping flow. The reason I got into this isJumping flow is that in order to cancel isJumping, a certain grace period had to have passed, and also the rigid body velocity on the Y needs to be negative. However, because I'm moving forward on a slope, I have a positive Y velocity. I then tried a bunch of things. I really don't remember what I was trying to do here, but it looks funny, so here it is. I tried doing a bunch of other things that can improve the jump, but I eventually came back to solving the slope jump bug. I first tried changing this end to an OR, but this made the jump cut too short. I increased the value in the if statement to be 1 instead of 0.2, which is roughly the time it takes to achieve max height from the jump. And that solved it. Lastly, I added an increase in gravity while my Y velocity is negative, just to have a less floaty jump. And that's it for now. The jump still needs more work. and I need to restore some behaviors that were lost when I added this jump, like allowing the character to be in air during some animation and not be affected by gravity. There's also an issue when I jump during lock-on, I rotate the character, which I don't want to do. So there's definitely a bit more work required on this. Sorry if this video was a bit more unorganized than usual. There were a lot of clips to sort through, and it has been a long time since I actually coded all of this. So my memory isn't real clear on what I tried to do each step. However, I am getting closer and closer to finishing the backlogs of videos I accumulated, and hopefully after I finish those, it would be easier to do the next devlogs. I am also thinking about making these devlogs shorter and more concise because they take a tremendous amount of time just to edit and make them. As always, thank you for watching. If you have any questions, let me know down in the comments, and leave a like if you can, and subscribe if you want to see more. And may all your bugs turn into features.